Before the documentary begins, I would like to provide a brief in a few lines first on the title, 1,000 Years of Medieval Europe Explained in 30 Minutes. Picture a continent frozen in fear. Kings fall, cities burn. A plague sweeps across the land and wipes out millions. Knights sworn to protect turn their swords on one another. Churches hold the power to crown rulers and condemn them to death. Ordinary people vanish into the darkness of history, while the elite write the stories we now call the Middle Ages. For 1,000 years, Europe lived through invasions, secret power struggles, holy wars, and deadly rivalries. Behind the castles and shining armor was a world filled with betrayal, superstition, and a constant fight to survive. It was an age where knowledge was controlled, faith could be used as a weapon, and entire kingdoms could disappear in a single winter. Tonight, we uncover the truth behind the era that shaped the modern world. From the ashes of the Roman Empire to the rise of powerful monarchies, from knights and crusaders to the Black Death, this is the untold story of medieval Europe. Stay with me. What you are about to discover is far more intense than what most history books ever show. Before we step into this 1,000-year journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more powerful documentaries like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next release. Now let's begin. Let us now begin the complete documentary on title, 1,000 Years of Medieval Europe Explained in 30 Minutes. The story of medieval Europe begins with a collapse that shook the known world. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been the backbone of European civilization. It provided law, order, roads, trade, education, and a sense of unity. When it fell in the year 476, it did not go quietly. The fall left behind confusion, broken systems, and a continent that no longer had a single power holding it together. With Rome gone, Europe entered a period where survival became more important than advancement. People no longer looked to grand cities or libraries. They looked for food, safety, and shelter. As Roman authority faded, waves of tribes and groups moved across Europe, each fighting for land and influence. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and others carved out pieces of territory, often through violence. Roads that once carried merchants and scholars now became dangerous. Trade slowed, cities shrank, and many people retreated to rural life. Knowledge that once flowed through the empire became limited to small pockets, mostly guarded by priests and monks. Europe did not simply become medieval overnight. It slowly transformed through uncertainty, fear, and constant shifting of power. In the absence of a large empire, communities began turning to the strongest local figures for protection. This created the early foundations of what later became known as feudalism. Power was local, not centralized. A lord with land could offer security in exchange for loyalty and service. People swore oaths because in a world without strong law, a sworn promise carried weight. Castles began to appear, not as symbols of glory, but as practical fortresses. They provided defense against rival warlords or raids that could strike at any moment. Life was unpredictable, and the idea of safety became a privilege rather than a right. Religion grew into a powerful source of stability during this uncertain time. The Christian Church stepped into the role that the empire had left behind. It offered rules, rituals, and a sense of community. It promised hope in a time when life was short and harsh. The Church taught that earthly suffering could be rewarded in the next life, and this belief gave many people comfort. Priests, monks, and bishops became important figures, not only spiritually but socially. They controlled knowledge, because they were among the few who could read and write. Monasteries preserved ancient texts, copied manuscripts, and held the keys to learning. This gave the Church influence that reached every corner of Europe. Over time, some rulers began to stand out. The Franks rose to power in Western Europe, and their king, Charlemagne, became one of the most significant figures of the early Middle Ages. He expanded his kingdom through military strength and clever alliances. In the year 800, he was crowned emperor by the Pope. This moment symbolically revived the idea of a united Europe under one ruler, at least in theory. Charlemagne encouraged education and administration. He supported schools and attempted to improve literacy among the clergy. For a while, it seemed Europe could rise again. Yet after his death, his empire broke apart, divided among his heirs, and Europe slipped back into fragmentation. As new threats appeared, life remained tough. From the east, groups like the Magyars raided settlements. From the south, coastal towns feared attacks. The most feared of all arrived from the north. The Vikings, skilled sailors and fierce warriors, traveled by sea and rivers to attack towns, monasteries, and villages. They struck without warning, took plunder, and then vanished. Their sudden raids weakened the fragile balance many communities relied on. People built stronger fortifications, placed guards along rivers, and lived with the constant expectation of danger. Stories of these raids spread across Europe, creating an atmosphere of dread. Yet the Vikings were not only attackers. Over time, many settled in the lands they raided. They traded, married into local families, adopted new customs, and in some cases, became rulers. One of the most famous examples was in the region that became known as Normandy, where Viking settlers eventually blended into the local culture. This shows how Europe was slowly reshaping itself. Groups that started as enemies could, over generations, become part of the continent's identity. While Europe struggled, it was never fully cut off from the rest of the world. The Islamic world to the south and east experienced a period of scientific and cultural growth. Scholars there made advances in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Trade routes continued, although limited. Some knowledge traveled back into Europe through contact with the Islamic world, especially in places like Spain and Sicily. These connections, though not strong yet, planted early seeds that would later influence Europe's development. Daily life for most people during this early medieval period remained simple and centered around survival. The average person lived in a small village, worked the land, and rarely traveled far. Houses were basic, food was plain, and winters could be deadly. Hunger, illness, and war were constant threats. Families worked together to produce what they needed. Tools were handmade, and tasks like farming, weaving, and baking consumed most of the year. Childhood was short, and many children did not reach adulthood. Yet even within these hardships, communities formed close bonds. Festivals, storytelling, and faith gave people moments of joy and meaning. Social structure became more defined. At the top were kings and nobles. Beneath them were knights, trained fighters who served in exchange for land or rewards. Below them were peasants, most of whom worked the land for others. A small number of people lived in towns, although towns were still growing. Merchants, craftsmen, and traders would become more important in later centuries, but for now, Europe was mostly rural. Life was shaped by the land and the seasons, not by cities or trade. By the end of this early period, a new order had formed. It was not the order of Rome, built on law and centralized power. It was local, personal, and built on loyalty and fear. Europe was not united. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, cultures, and customs, each with its own rules. The church stood above all as the one institution that connected people across borders. Feudalism gave structure, but also tied people into rigid roles that were hard to escape. The early Middle Ages set the stage for everything that came next. Kings would rise and fall. Faith would become both a guiding light and a tool of control, and Europe would face forces that shaped its identity forever. As Europe moved deeper into the medieval age, the influence of faith and power grew stronger and more complex. The church had already become the most trusted institution in the early centuries, but now it evolved into something far greater. It was no longer just a spiritual guide. It shaped laws, crowned kings, collected wealth, and influenced every part of daily life. From birth to death, the church had a presence in people's lives. It preached that obedience brought salvation, and questioning the church could risk the soul. This made religion a powerful force that rulers needed on their side. Kings understood that if the church supported them, their rule felt more legitimate. Crowns were often given with the blessing of the pope, and this blessing carried weight. Monarchs used faith to secure loyalty, and the church used kings to protect its influence. It was a partnership, but one filled with tension. Each wanted authority over the other. Popes claimed they were chosen by God and therefore above kings. Kings believed they ruled by divine right and should not be controlled by the church. This constant struggle created one of the most defining power battles of the medieval era. While rulers fought for influence, society around them began to change. Towns started to grow and trade increased. Merchants traveled to buy and sell goods, and markets brought people together. With trade came money, and with money came new opportunities. A class of people began to rise who did not fit neatly into the old feudal order. They were not nobles, knights, or peasants. They were tradesmen, merchants, bankers, and skilled workers. They built their own wealth and relied less on land and more on business. This started to weaken the traditional system where power came mainly from land ownership. As Europe gained more confidence, attention turned outward. One of the most dramatic events of the medieval period began in the late 11th century. The Crusades were a series of religious wars that started when the Pope called on Christians to reclaim the Holy Land. The message spread with passion. People were told they were fighting for God and that those who joined would be forgiven for their sins. Knights saw it as a chance for honor and glory. Peasants saw hope for a new life. Many believed they were chosen for a holy mission. The Crusades inspired thousands to leave home, travel across continents, and fight in battles they barely understood. The Crusades had mixed results. They brought victory at times and loss at others. They caused suffering and violence for many, including innocent people. Yet they also connected Europe with other cultures, especially the Islamic world, which had preserved knowledge in science, mathematics, and medicine. Contact with new ideas opened Europe's mind, even if slowly. Goods like spices, cloth, and new foods entered Europe and changed tastes and lifestyles. Ideas about science and scholarship also began to return, planting seeds that would later grow. Within Europe, religious devotion did not always lead to peace. There were moments of intense fear and suspicion. People worried about anything they did not understand. Natural disasters, strange illnesses, or unexpected hardships were sometimes blamed on sin or the work of unseen evil. The church tried to keep control, but its power was tested at times. One major test came when kings demanded more control over their own lands. The conflict between church and monarchy grew. In some cases, kings tried to choose their own bishops or interfere in church decisions. This led to dramatic confrontations, some of which shook the foundations of Europe. During this time, the everyday life of a medieval European continued to evolve, yet remained rooted in hard work and routine. Villages grew into towns, and towns began to develop into small cities. Guilds formed to protect workers and maintain quality in trades. People became more connected through markets, fairs, and trade routes. A sense of community expanded beyond village borders. Still, daily life was physically demanding. Most people worked long hours for modest results. Food shortages were common, and winter brought fear of hunger. Diseases, poor hygiene, and limited medical knowledge made health fragile. Life expectancy remained low for most. The nobility enjoyed a very different lifestyle. Their days included managing land, settling disputes, training for combat, and attending feasts. Their homes were fortified, but inside there were tapestries, servants, and privileges unavailable to others. Knights lived by a code of chivalry, at least in theory. It encouraged courage, loyalty, and fairness, but reality was often harsher. Warfare between nobles was common as each sought more land and influence. Castles showed wealth and strength, but they also represented a world built on control and fear. Anyone who lived near a castle knew that a change in leadership could bring sudden changes to their lives. As centuries passed, Europe faced one of the most devastating events in its history. In the mid-14th century, a deadly disease arrived that would spread with alarming speed. It became known as the Black Death. It is believed to have begun in Asia, then traveled through trade routes and reached Europe by ship. In towns and cities, the disease spread through crowded streets, markets, and homes. It killed with frightening speed. Many victims died within days of first feeling unwell. Symptoms were horrifying, and fear spread even faster than the disease. Within a few years, the Black Death had wiped out a large part of Europe's population. Entire villages were abandoned. Families died together. Priests struggled to offer comfort, often becoming victims themselves. Work stopped in many places. Fields went untended. Trade paused. The world felt as if it was falling apart. People looked for explanations. Some believed it was punishment for sin. Others blamed outsiders or turned to superstition. The church could not provide answers or protection, and many began to question its authority. The plague changed Europe in deep and lasting ways, both socially and mentally. With so many people gone, the balance of power shifted. Labor became valuable because there were fewer workers. Peasants found they could demand better conditions or move elsewhere for improved lives. Lords who once controlled land and labor now struggled to maintain their estates. This weakened the old feudal system. The loss of life also created a sense of reflection. People started thinking more about the world, about life, and about knowledge. The limitations of medieval beliefs were exposed, and curiosity began to grow. New ideas quietly spread, and old truths were no longer accepted without question. As the plague slowly faded, Europe was not the same. The Crusades, the rise of towns, the power struggle between church and kings, and the trauma of the Black Death all pushed Europe toward change. Knowledge, culture, and thought began moving in a new direction. Universities started to appear. Students and scholars looked back at ancient Greek and Roman learning, which had been preserved elsewhere. This rediscovery would soon inspire a transformation. Europe was now reaching the end of the medieval period. The foundations that had held society together for centuries were weakening. People were thinking differently. Kings wanted stronger nations. Merchants wanted freedom to trade. Scholars wanted knowledge. The church still held power, but its influence was being questioned. Europe was entering a moment where old systems would be tested and new ideas would rise. Something was about to begin that would reshape everything once again. As Europe moved toward the later medieval centuries, the forces that once shaped and controlled society began to weaken. The church, the nobility, and the traditional feudal system had held power for generations, but now the ground beneath them began to shift. People had survived wars, witnessed the rise and fall of kings, and endured the worst pandemic the world had seen. These experiences changed how they thought about life, knowledge, and authority. The old ways no longer seemed unbreakable. A transformation was building, not through a sudden event, but through years of pressure, conflict, and discovery. The medieval world was reaching its breaking point, and from this tension, a new age was preparing to emerge. One of the forces that weakened the medieval order was the growing desire of kings to centralize their power. For centuries, kings ruled, but their control was limited. Local nobles had their own armies, collected their own taxes, and enforced their own laws. A king could only be strong if his nobles supported him. After the Black Death, when labor became scarce and power structures shifted, many kings saw a chance to strengthen their control. They began creating stronger governments, developing systems of taxation, and relying on trained officials instead of nobles to manage their kingdoms. They invested in armies loyal to the crown rather than to feudal lords. This was the beginning of nations forming rather than loose territories ruled by many separate lords. With stronger kingdoms rising, conflicts between nations also increased. One of the most significant examples was the long and exhausting struggle between England and France, known today as the 100 Years' War. It lasted from the 14th to the 15th century, not in one continuous fight, but through a series of battles, truces, and shifting alliances. At its heart was a question of legitimacy and power. Both sides believed they had a rightful claim to the French throne. The war changed how armies fought. In the early medieval period, knights on horseback decided battles, and armor and swords symbolized strength. During this conflict, new tactics and weapons appeared. The longbow, for example, made armored knights less dominant. Later in the war, early forms of gunpowder weapons began to appear, hinting at the end of medieval warfare. The war also influenced national identity. People started seeing themselves as English or French, not just loyal to a local lord. While kings strengthened power and nations began to form, the church faced internal challenges that shook its authority. For centuries, the church had guided belief, education, and morality. It had been the one institution people trusted above kings. But after the Black Death, when the church could not provide answers or protection, doubts grew. People noticed corruption, greed, and political games within the church. At one point, there were even rival popes who claimed authority, dividing loyalty among Christians. This weakened the image of the church as a united moral institution. Scholars and ordinary people began to question church practices. These early doubts would later fuel movements that changed the religious landscape of Europe. At the same time, ideas were spreading faster than before. This was supported by a quiet revolution in learning that began in the late medieval period. Throughout Europe, universities were founded, and scholars became interested in studying subjects outside the traditional religious curriculum. They began reading ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved in other parts of the world. These works introduced new ways of thinking about logic, science, and philosophy. Instead of simply accepting beliefs, people began to explore and question how the world worked. This intellectual curiosity encouraged creativity and innovation. It prepared the way for a cultural awakening known later as the Renaissance. The Renaissance did not begin instantly, but its roots formed during the final centuries of the medieval age. As new ideas spread, the economy also changed. Trade networks expanded across Europe and beyond. Merchants traveled by land and sea and brought back not only goods, but new knowledge. Banking systems developed, making it easier for businesses to grow. Wealth was no longer tied only to land. This allowed people outside the nobility to gain influence and freedom. Towns grew into cities, and city life created a different kind of society. People interacted with others from various backgrounds, exchanged ideas, and built communities that did not rely on the old feudal systems. A middle class was emerging, and it challenged the traditional three-group division of society into nobles, clergy, and peasants. These shifts also influenced culture. Art, literature, and architecture began to reflect changing values. Churches and cathedrals remained significant, but new designs aimed to inspire thought, beauty, and human experience. Writers recorded not only religious texts, but stories, poems, and reflections on life. Language changed, too. Instead of writing everything in Latin, people began writing in their own local languages, which made knowledge accessible to more readers. Education reached a wider audience, and reading became a path to personal growth rather than a privilege reserved for a few. While Europe was changing internally, it was also becoming more aware of the wider world. Travel and exploration increased. Europeans met new cultures, some through trade and some through conquest. These encounters broadened understanding of geography and different ways of life. It encouraged curiosity about lands beyond Europe and created a desire for exploration that would eventually lead to global voyages. The medieval period was ending, and a new world was forming, one that looked outward with ambition and confidence. The final blow to the medieval order came with a series of events that exposed the weaknesses of the old systems. Peasant revolts broke out in different countries as ordinary people demanded better treatment and refused to remain silent. Nobles could no longer rely on unquestioned loyalty. The invention of the printing press made it possible to share information quickly and widely, spreading new ideas further than ever before. Gunpowder continued to change warfare, reducing the power of castles and knights. Monarchs, not nobles, controlled armies, and nation-states grew stronger. The church, once unchallenged, faced criticism and division that would soon lead to major reform. Europe was turning a page, and the medieval world, with all its rigid structures, was fading. By the late 15th century, Europe was standing at the edge of a new era. The medieval period had begun with the fall of an empire and years of struggle for stability. It passed through the rise of kings, the dominance of the church, the trauma of the plague, and the gradual shift in knowledge and society. What emerged at the end was a continent ready for transformation. People thought differently, believed differently, worked differently, and governed differently. The systems that had defined life for 1,000 years had weakened, making space for new ideas to flourish. The age that followed would bring exploration, scientific discovery, artistic achievement, religious reform, and a completely new way of viewing humanity and the world. Europe was preparing to step out of the medieval shadow and into a time of creativity and change. The medieval journey had been long, often dark, and full of hardship, but it shaped the identity of Europe. It taught resilience, inspired knowledge, and laid the foundations for the modern age that would follow. The story of medieval Europe is not a simple journey from darkness to light. It is 1,000 years of human endurance, ambition, survival, faith, conflict, and transformation. It began with a continent shattered by the fall of the Roman Empire, forced to rebuild itself with little more than fear and determination holding communities together. People who once lived under a structured and educated empire suddenly found themselves in a world where knowledge was rare, war was common, and survival became the only goal. From those ruins, Europe learned how to shape itself again, not through comfort or peace, but through facing crisis after crisis. For generations, power rested in the hands of those who owned land and controlled belief. Kings depended on loyalty, and loyalty depended on fear or reward. The church stood at the center of life, guiding, teaching, and at times intimidating, shaping the hearts and minds of millions. Faith offered hope, but it also ruled thought. In a world where every disaster could be interpreted as a sign from above, belief often replaced reason. Yet belief also kept people united in moments when fear threatened to tear society apart. The medieval soul lived between faith and fear, between devotion and doubt. The arrival of the Crusades showed how belief could ignite thousands into action. A call from a single voice could send men across continents into battles they did not fully understand. These wars carried suffering to both sides, but they also opened Europe's eyes to knowledge and cultures more advanced than their own. Ideas once locked behind borders began to move with merchants, scholars, and travelers. This exchange planted seeds that would one day grow into a shift far greater than anyone of that era could imagine. But no change reshaped Europe more violently than the plague. When the Black Death swept across the land, it did far more than claim lives. It tore apart systems that had seemed unshakable. Entire families vanished. Land lost value when there were too few left to farm it. Peasants demanded better treatment or moved to places where life offered more chances. The plague forced Europe to confront the fragility of life and the limits of the old order. It weakened blind obedience. It awakened questions that had long remained unspoken. In the silence left behind by millions of lost voices, new thoughts began to grow. As the medieval centuries reached their end, the grip of the old world loosened. Kings wanted stronger nations rather than scattered lands. People wanted knowledge rather than fear. Merchants wanted freedom rather than restrictions. Scholars wanted answers based on truth, not tradition. The church, once unchallenged, found itself questioned by minds no longer willing to accept without understanding. The world was preparing to move. The medieval age, built on war, faith, loyalty, and survival, had pushed Europe to its limits. Now it stood at the edge of something new. The transition into the next era was not gentle. It was a spark waiting to ignite ideas that would challenge the very core of society. Art, science, exploration, invention, and a hunger for truth were gathering force. The medieval world had preserved knowledge just enough for it to be rediscovered. It had built cathedrals and universities that would soon nurture genius. It had survived enough suffering for people to crave change. The age that followed did not simply continue history. It broke the pattern completely and set a new measure for human achievement. The medieval chapter closes with a continent ready to redefine itself. A world that once feared the unknown was about to seek it. A society that once accepted limits was about to question everything. The minds of the next generation were not shaped by fear of the past, but by curiosity for the future. What began as a struggle to survive after Rome's fall ended as a preparation for the rise of something extraordinary. The story of medieval Europe does not end with silence. It ends with a door opening. For beyond this 1,000-year journey waits a new chapter of discovery, brilliance, rebellion, and transformation. A time when artists would reshape beauty, when scientists would challenge nature, when explorers would cross oceans believing there was more to see than the world they knew. The question is no longer how Europe survived the medieval age. The real question is how far it would go once it broke free from it. And if you thought this story was intense, what follows will challenge everything you learned here. For the next chapter of history is not a continuation. It is a revolution of the human mind, a rebirth of knowledge, and the beginning of a world that looks more familiar to ours today. The rise of ideas, inventions, genius, and exploration will push humanity into a new age that historians still struggle to fully comprehend. The medieval world has ended, but what awakened after it would change the course of civilization forever. The mystery waiting on the other side of this era is not only powerful, it is unforgettable. Are you ready to step into the age that turned darkness into brilliance?